Hey, Legacy Church, Pastor Thomas here with you again. We are now in our second week of our Family Matters series, and I'm excited to see where we go today. You know, one of my all-time favorite board games is Monopoly, not just because of the gameplay, but because of the adaptability. Monopoly may be the only board game where everyone who plays the game plays the same game, but has their own family rules. Did you notice that? You sit down with another family, and about 6 minutes into the game, somebody lands on free parking and reaches for the giant pile of cash in the middle of the board, and you say, "What are you doing?" And they say, "Well, I landed on free parking." Okay, congratulations, right? Nothing's supposed to happen. And yet they look at you like you've just robbed them of their inheritance. Or maybe you land on a certain space and you have to pick up a card at a different time. Or maybe you land on a property that you don't want to buy, and so you just kind of move on. But technically, the rules say that property is supposed to go up for auction. And yet, nobody really does that. Some families let you collect $400 if you land directly on go. Some let you borrow money from other players. And some play Monopoly with children, at which point there are no rules, right? There's only negotiations. Every family has its own version of Monopoly. And the funny thing is that house rules, they don't stop when you put the board game back in the box. Every house has its own set of rules, right? Some are written down, but most aren't. You don't even know that they exist until you break one. For example, maybe you go over to a friend's house and you sit down in a chair and suddenly everybody gets quiet. And somebody finally says, "Ooh, that's Dad's chair." Or maybe you wash your hands and you dry them on those beautiful towels in the bathroom, only to discover that those towels aren't actually for drying your hands. Apparently, they're just decorative towels, which means that somebody bought a towel whose job is to not actually be a towel. But then you get married and you discover that your spouse's family has an entirely different set of house rules. And you spend the rest of your life trying to teach them how their house rules are wrong and your house rules are right. How to load a dishwasher, how early you have to leave for the airport, what counts as clean. And all of those little things eventually teach you something important, that every family creates its own little world. And part of the fun of having a family is deciding who you get to let in on those little traditions. Habits, expectations, inside jokes, routines, ways of talking, ways of handling money, ways of spending time, ways of welcoming people, and ways of dealing with stress. Most families never sit down and intentionally decide all of that. It just kind of develops. 1,000 small choices become habits. And those habits become rhythms. And eventually those rhythms create a culture. Every family has a culture, whether we intentionally create it or not, which extends beyond the season of just raising kids, of course. Families can take on many forms. Some people are currently in the process of raising kids. Others have adult children or grandchildren, or they care for their parents, or maybe they have friendships that have become like family. Whatever your situation looks like, you're helping to create an environment around the people closest to you. And there's a way that it feels to spend time with you. And over time, the people around us figure out what really matters to us by how we actually live. And so the question that I want us to wrestle with today is, what kind of culture are we creating? You know, last week we looked backwards at the families that shaped us, but today we're looking forward at the families that we're becoming. So what do you want it to feel like to belong to your family? Maybe you want your home to be marked by joy or faith or generosity, laughter or peace or hospitality, or just the sense that people really matter. Or maybe there are things from your family, the one you grew up with, that you actually want to leave behind. But either way, we need to be intentional about the type of family that we're building. Don't forget, though, that strong family isn't built on one big decision. Sometimes we look for those big moments and assume that it's all about getting those moments right. But most of the time, a healthy culture gets built through the everyday decisions of an ordinary life. Meals and car rides and schedules and weekends and bedtimes. Those moments, they don't feel important, but over time, they become the story of a family. The strongest families intentionally create the culture that they want people they love to experience. And that idea is actually at the heart of Deuteronomy chapter 6. Israel's preparing to enter the promised land. For 400 years, they lived in slavery. And for the last 40 years, they've lived in the wilderness. But now a new generation is preparing to cross the Jordan and settle down. And Moses knows that he isn't going with them. And so Deuteronomy becomes that final opportunity to prepare them for what comes next. And when that time comes, one of his greatest concerns isn't whether they can conquer cities, it's whether they'll remember God once life becomes comfortable. They're about to live in cities that they didn't build, houses that are filled with things they didn't provide. And they're about to eat from vineyards that they didn't plant. Their time in the wilderness is ending, and normal life is about to begin. And Moses understands that sometimes the greatest threat to faith isn't suffering, it's comfort. See, they know hardship. They lived in slavery for 400 years. They've struggled and suffered. But when life fills up and things are going well, it becomes easy to move God from the center of life to the edges. And so before Israel builds houses, Moses talks to them about what kind of life they're going to build inside those houses. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." Deuteronomy chapter 6, all the way to verse 9. This became one of the foundational texts of the Jewish faith. It's called the Shema because the opening Hebrew word Shema means to hear or to listen. And the idea behind this word is about more than just hearing words. It's actually about responding. And so when Moses says, "Hear, O Israel," he's basically saying, pay attention because this needs to shape how you live. And so he says, listen up, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Notice what Moses puts at the very beginning of this new lifestyle commandment. At the center of everything that would follow, he says the center isn't the family, the center is God. Why? Because Moses understands that if we want to build a healthy family culture, we have to decide what matters most. Before he talks about children or houses or schedules or routines or conversations, he starts with God. Because every family eventually organizes itself around something, doesn't it? There's always a center of gravity. For one family, it might be achievement. For another, it might be a person, a matriarch or a patriarch, a parent or a grandparent. But there's always a center of gravity. Take a moment to think about what that might mean for your family. What's the central driving force that people in your family strive to please? What do they have to actually live up to? What are you building your lives around? Now, if you're having trouble identifying that thing, just take a moment to answer the following questions. What gets protected when the calendar gets crowded? What gets our best energy? What are we willing to rearrange everything else around to accommodate? We can say our marriage matters while never actually protecting time for it. We can tell our kids that following Jesus matters most, but if every other activity is protected and our life with God is always negotiable, they'll notice, right? A value becomes a part of your culture when it begins to shape your choices. Does that make sense? Moses doesn't stop there, though. Not only are we supposed to love God, we're supposed to love him with all of our strength. Now, the word strength here is actually kind of an interesting word. The Hebrew word is me'ad, and it's a word that kind of means something like very much or abundance. In other words, when we love God with all of our strength, it's not just loving God with all of our muscles. Moses is basically saying, love God with the full weight of your life, with your time, your energy, your resources, your opportunities, everything that God has entrusted to you. God isn't supposed to occupy one small category of your life. He's supposed to become the center that helps, that everything is ordered around. Which raises a really practical question. What do you want your family to be known for? You don't need a family mission statement hung on the walls of your living room, but what do the closest people around you know about what matters? Maybe you want your home to be a place where people feel welcome, or maybe you want your family to be known as the kind of family that helps someone in need. Or maybe your grandchildren associate your house with laughter or prayer or good food or knowing that there was always room for them. I remember being told a story about our friend Daryl Ledford, a member of our church who passed last April of last year. And he was sitting outside of his house when a group of teenagers came by. And he began to talk to him, as he always did with people walking by his house. And they asked him if he had any food to eat. And he could tell that there was likely a problem with food scarcity at hand. And so from that point on, he asked his wife, Diane, to always make sure they had food that they could put in a basket outside the house, so that if kids were walking by and they were hungry, they knew they could come up to the house and grab something. Being a welcoming host was important to him, and that was one of the ways that he lived out the values of his family. Verse 6 would go on to say, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Notice the order. First on your hearts. Then in verse 7, it says, impress them on your children. In other words, we have to live out our values before we can effectively pass them on. Do you remember the old emergency guides in the back seat of planes, right? Where you're supposed to put the oxygen mask on your own face before you help the child next to you? Why? Well, because if you run out of oxygen trying to put your kid's mask on, you might die first and not be able to help them at all. If you want to raise a family right, you would be wise to get your own life in order first. There's an old saying, do what I say and not what I do. Unfortunately, that's kind of a crock of bull, right? If you want someone to reflect your values, you have to live them out yourself. Family culture is shaped less by what we claim to value and more by what the people closest to us consistently see us value. Parents, they can bring their children to church, and I hope they do. We've got a great kids ministry and youth ministry. But nobody gets the same view of your faith as your family. They see whether Jesus actually matters to you more than just on Sundays. They watch what happens when plans change. They see what happens and what gets your attention, whether generosity and hospitality are things you admire or things you practice. And this applies far beyond our parenting, doesn't it? You can tell your spouse that they're the highest earthly priority, but eventually your schedule needs to agree. We can tell our parents how much they mean to us, but if we never call them, it doesn't really mean all that much, does it? We can say that our friendships matter while disappearing every time life gets crowded. The culture that we create reveals the difference between the values we admire and the values we actually live out. Now, that doesn't mean that the people around us need to see perfection. They won't, right? And truthfully, that might be the healthiest thing that you can model for them. They can see you change your mind because you were wrong. Apologize without making excuses. Choose generosity when keeping would be easier, or rearrange a busy week because someone that you love needs you. The question isn't whether the people closest to you see perfection. It's whether they can see that what we say matters really does. After reminding the Israelites of the importance of practicing what they preach, Moses turns to the ordinary rhythms of life. In verse 7, he says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. I love how normal that sounds. Moses isn't describing some impossible religious standard. He's not demanding that we move to monasteries in the mountains and walk around barefoot. Basically, he's just describing a Tuesday afternoon, right? Sitting at home, going somewhere, ending the day, starting another one. He's trying to get his people to understand that meaningful spiritual formation happens in the ordinary moments of life. There's an interesting Hebrew word that's behind the phrase impress them. It's the word shanan, and it's connected with the idea of sharpening. And the picture is meant to describe something becoming sharp through repeated impact. Have you ever sharpened a knife before? One pass doesn't really do much, right? The effect comes over time, pass after pass after pass. And I think that's a great picture of family culture. Most of what deeply shapes us isn't formed through one spectacular moment. It's formed through what happens over and over and over again, which means that we need to build what matters into ordinary life. And this is where it's going to get really practical. If you want a culture where people feel seen, don't just say we need to communicate better, create a practice. Maybe when everybody comes home, the first 10 minutes are phone free, right? Before anyone disappears into the other room to do homework or TV or email or clean up their room, you give each person 10 minutes of undivided attention. How was your day? What happened to you today? Anything that I need to know about? When you do that, you're saying that when you walk through this door, you matter. Or if you want your family to become more compassionate, change one of the questions you ask around the table. Instead of just asking, how was your day? Try asking, who did you notice today? Was someone sitting alone? Did somebody seem stressed? Did you see someone who might need encouragement? See, you're training your family to look outward, to think of others before themselves. If you want generosity to become a part of your culture, create a generosity fund. It doesn't have to be impressive. Maybe every month you put a little money aside, and as a family, you decide who gets it. Maybe a teacher who needs supplies, or a struggling neighbor. Or maybe you go out to dinner and you decide to just give a huge tip to the waiter. The amount doesn't matter. What matters more than the amount is the repeated message that part of what God gives us is meant to flow through us. Or if you want to create a culture of gratitude in your family, don't just tell everybody to be thankful, create a ritual. Maybe on Friday night, everybody names one thing during the week that they don't want to forget about. Might be something big, or maybe it's something as ordinary as grandma came over, or dad made pancakes, or I finally passed the test, right? You're teaching yourselves to notice the goodness that would otherwise disappear into the speed of life. Or if hospitality matters, put it on the calendar before life fills the calendar for you. Maybe one Sunday a month, the question is, who can we invite to lunch? Not your best friend every time, maybe somebody new, somebody lonely, somebody that sits alone in church. Or maybe somebody from church that you talk to 3 minutes every Sunday, but you haven't had a chance to get to know. Over time, your home begins telling the people in it, there's room for you here. If you want your marriage to have a real connection, don't wait for a magical date night to appear. Maybe 3 nights a week after the house settles down, you sit down on the couch for 15 minutes with no television and no phones, not to solve problems, but to just ask, how are you really doing? 15 minutes. That can change the emotional climate of any marriage. Or if your family is constantly running in different directions, create a 10-minute weekly reset. Maybe it's Sunday afternoon or Monday night, whatever works. Everybody look at the week together and figure out a time when you can all come together and just have a little moment, right, to reset. Who has something hard coming up? Who needs a ride? Who has a test? When are our meetings? When are our games? When are our deadlines? Who can use prayer? Have you ever asked your kids if they need prayer for something? If not, why not? It communicates your life matters to us and we're paying attention. If phones are replacing the moments of your home, don't just complain about screen time. Give the phones a place to go. A basket, a charging station, a drawer, or maybe meals are phone free, at least for the first 30 minutes, right? So that when people come home and they're eating together, that time is protected. The goal isn't punishment, it's to make attention easier. Because the phones that we have make it so easy to sit just a few feet away from someone without ever having to acknowledge them. There's a difference between proximity and presence. Some of the best conversations you'll ever have will be with your children when you weren't planning to have them. They'll happen in the car at 11 o'clock at night when you thought they were asleep in the back seat, or while you're cleaning the kitchen. And I think marriage and friendships work the same way. Sometimes an important conversation only surfaces because there was enough space for it to surface. You can fill your calendar with good things and still discover that there was no room left for the people that you love. Healthy family culture needs enough ordinary life together to make those moments happen. And because ordinary life moves quickly, Moses gives Israel one more instruction. Create rhythms that keep what matters in front of you. Moses says this, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Deuteronomy 6, verse 8 through 9. Jewish tradition eventually developed these little practices around these verses. If you've been to Israel or around Orthodox Jews, you might have seen them wearing these small boxes. They're called phylacteries, and they contain scripture called tefillin during prayer. And many Jewish homes still have a mezuzah attached to the doorpost. And the idea is, if it's that important to you, keep it front and center. Don't lose sight of it. Don't stray. Don't assume that just because it's important to you, that you're automatically going to live like it's important every day. We forget, we get distracted. And so we need rhythms to remind us of what we value. This verse also reminds us that good rhythms don't need to be complicated. Maybe every birthday includes a time around the table where every person tells them one thing they appreciate about the birthday boy or birthday girl. Or maybe before a big decision, your family says, let's sleep on it and pray before we decide. Maybe once a year, you take your kids or your grandkids somewhere meaningful and you tell them a part of your family story. Or maybe you celebrate what's been answered in prayer by writing it on a card and dropping it in a jar, and then reading the cards together at the end of the year. I mean, these aren't big religious spectacles. They're just ordinary things. But that's the point, that culture is built through repeated ordinary things. The goal isn't to create an impressive family, it's to create a meaningful one. And that happens one decision at a time. So go home today, and in the car ride home, pick one thing. Look at the culture that you have in your family, the culture you say you want, and say, what's one practice that could make the things we value more visible? One meal, one conversation, one boundary, one tradition, one recurring act of generosity, one protected piece of the calendar. Culture doesn't develop in a weekend. It grows slowly. But that also means that small choices practiced over time become incredibly significant. And eventually, when practiced for long enough, a rhythm stops feeling like a program and it starts feeling like this is just who we are. Which brings us back to the most important question of the passage. What is our culture supposed to be centered around? Deuteronomy chapter 6 isn't just a passage about how to create a close family. It's about building a life around God. You know, later in the chapter, Moses imagines a child asking in the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of these stipulations and decrees and the laws that our Lord God has commanded you? In other words, Dad, why do we do these things? Why do these things matter? Why is God such a big part of our life? And Moses, he doesn't tell them the answer because those are the rules or because that's why we do it or because that's how we've always done it. He tells them the story. He rescued us. God brought us out. God gave us new life. See, the goal isn't to give people religious habits for the sake of religious habits. It's to help us understand the God whom those habits point towards. You know, centuries later, somebody asked Jesus which commandment matters most. And listen to where Jesus goes. He says, the most important one, Jesus answered, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Did you see what Jesus did? He reaches right back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, back to the Shema, back to the center. Love God with everything you have, with the full weight of your life. For us, it's really about learning to go to the deepest parts of ourselves and allow God to create a culture within us that reflects his values and character. You know, underneath all of this should be something deeper, and that's a deep love for Jesus. Not just at church, not just on Sundays, but in the ordinary life that we're building together, in our choices, in our schedules, in our relationships, and the way we use what God has given us. You know, one of the greatest gifts that we can give the people close to us is the opportunity to see that following Jesus isn't just another category on a calendar. He's at the center. He's the gravitational force that's drawing us back into the deep well of his love. You know, if you're on the other side of raising a family, sometimes these reminders might stir a sense of regret. Maybe you have adult children and immediately think of the things that you wish you had done differently. Your family may not look like anything you expected it would. There may be years that you can't redo or relationships that you can't control. But the message that we're talking about today isn't about going backwards. It's about asking what you can build right now. Because if you're still breathing, you still have time to build a healthy family. A grandparent can build a new tradition. A marriage can create a new rhythm of life 30 years later. Adult children can become more intentional about their parents. A single person can make their home a place where other people feel comfortable sitting at the table. As long as God has given us relationships, we have an opportunity to shape the culture around those relationships. So with that being said, let me bring it back to the question that I posed at the very beginning. What do you want it to feel like to belong to your family? Forget what it looks like from the outside. Think about what the people who actually experience life with you feel. Years from now, they probably won't remember most of what you bought for them or every meal you cooked for them or every conversation, but they will remember what it felt like to belong. And my prayer is that we create families where people matter, where there's room for laughter, where people show up for one another, where faith is real, where Jesus wasn't just somebody that your family talks about at church, but that he's actually a part of your everyday life. You know, that kind of culture doesn't happen accidentally. It's built slowly through ordinary choices over the course of a lifetime. And by the grace of God, we can start building that today. Amen. Next week, we're going to talk about the church family and what that means for us as a whole. So we'll see you next week. Thanks, Legacy Church. God bless you.